I'll be in tip-top shape. Today is exactly 4 months to the day when I had the triple bypass. And I thought I'd be a lot better by now, but then I developed what they called AFib. I kept telling the doctor I wasn't feeling good, and he said, "You got AFib." I said, "No, I'm telling you the truth." But anyway, I finally figured out what they were talking about. My heart was too fast and out of rhythm, and he said the medication would probably get it back, but then 3 months later it hadn't, so then they had to go back and shock my heart and get it back into proper rhythm and rate, and so far that's done good, but that impeded my therapy. Therefore, I'm not where I ought to be. Roger, do I look as old to you as you do to me? I was just thinking a while ago, when I moved to Bremen, 1985, I was 46 years old. In about a week, I'll be 78. So I guess we could figure out that it was like 31 years ago. So a lot of things have happened since then. But I love you folks, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I hope I've got enough strength to do the lesson. If I don't, we'll just do something else. If you have your Bibles, you might want to turn to Mark chapter 2. We're going to look at the first 12 verses in that chapter. And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house. And straightway many were gathered together, insomuch as there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. And he preached the word to them. And they come to him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto them for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was. And when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the sick of the palsy, "Son, thy sins are forgiven thee." But there were certain of the scribes sitting there, reasoning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only?" And immediately when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they reasoned within themselves, he said to them, "Why reason ye these things in your hearts? Whether is it easier to say unto the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Arise and take up thy bed and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sin, he said to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, Arise and take up thy bed and go thy way into thine house. And immediately he arose and took up his bed and went forth before them all, insomuch they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, We never saw it on this fashion. We're going to be looking at a particular miracle that took place. I believe your theme is miracles in the New Testament or miracles in Mark. I'm not sure what the theme is. And I'm sure that there's been enough said about the miracles themselves, the New Testament miracles, and the fact that we don't have them today, so we're not going to go all into that. We're just going to look at the text, these 12 verses, and see what we can glean from them. So we start with verse 1, and again, he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was heard or noised that he was in the house. Let's look a minute at Capernaum itself. It's a village on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee, and really one of the most prominent towns mentioned in the New Testament and in the life of Jesus. About 16 times in the King James Version was this site mentioned and used for teaching and miracles. And so it's not a strange city when we see Capernaum. Peter, Andrew, James, and John lived here. And also near here, he recruited Matthew as an apostle. So it is a prominent city in the New Testament and mentioned several times. Matthew calls Capernaum Jesus' own city. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which was upon the seacoast in the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali. This screen is bigger than the monitor. I don't know how it's showing up there. I guess it's okay. So I'm having to make out what some of the letters are if I seem to be stuttering, which seems to be normal to you when I'm preaching anyway. So anyway, Capernaum is really Jesus' second home. Of course, we know he was from Nazareth, but Capernaum is called his own city. But here in Capernaum, Jesus had a discussion with his apostles concerning who would be the greatest in the kingdom. And of course, we know from that discussion that they really did not have a concept at that point in time of what the kingdom would be. And there were several miracles performed in Capernaum. He pronounced a condemnation upon them also in Matthew chapter 11, verses 23 and 24. And you, Capernaum, who are exalted to heaven, will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained unto this day. But I say to you that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you. Now that's really a great condemnation when you think about it, to be placed upon some people. And we know Sodom, and remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the destruction of them and so forth. That's a story I'm sure that all of us are very familiar with. But he said, they would have listened more than you. They would have paid more attention than you. And it'd be more tolerable for them in the judgment itself. So it's quite a condemnation that he places on these folks. If you look at the miracles that took place in Capernaum, there was the man with the unclean spirit. We find that in Mark chapter 1, verses 23 to 26. Also, we have the healing of Simon Peter's mother-in-law, also in chapter 1 of the book of Mark. In fact, there's a lot of miracles in Mark, and I believe I saw in your bulletin where Chad was running, I believe it was, I forgot the boy's name from over Mississippi. I know him well, Rushmore, I believe his name. But anyway, he was running some articles that he had written on miracles in Mark. But Simon Peter's mother-in-law, of course, this has often been used to show that Peter actually would not even have been qualified to be the Pope since he was married himself. But, of course, we know that Peter was not the Pope anyway. But that has been an argument that has served well in trying to refute the idea that Peter was the first Pope. There were many sick with various diseases. Doesn't name them individually. It just talks about all the different kinds of miracles that took place. There were those who were demon-possessed. And all of this takes place in the first chapter of Mark. And then the centurion's son that he did not even see. Matthew records this in the 8th chapter, verses 5 through 13. But then we have the one assigned to me tonight to discuss, that Jesus heals a paralytic. This is found, of course, in these verses in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. So we can see there's a lot of miracles that had taken place here in this city and in a very short period of time, really, as we look at the first chapter of Mark. Well, let's look at this statement, first of all. It was heard that he was in the house. Now think about that for a moment. It was heard that he was in the house. And I want to ask the question, what happens when Jesus is in the house? Well, let's back up. What happens when Jesus is in the house and people know about it? I mean, think about it. Jesus had promised, if 2 and 3 gather together, I'll be in the midst of you. And I think sometimes we fail to realize the significance of that. And for that reason, a lot of people aren't aware that Jesus is here. But if he was here in the flesh, people would still have to know about it, and somebody would have to tell about it. And I think one of the problems we have today in that we do not have the results that we ought to have is that we're not telling enough people that Jesus is in the house. Folks, this is something we ought not to keep secret. This is something we ought not to keep to ourselves. That we ought to let people know that Jesus is in the house. Because you see, Jesus has a drawing power. If you remember, he was talking about his death in John chapter 12, verse 32, when he said, I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. Of course, he was speaking of the manner in which he would die, speaking of the cross itself. But here's the power that Jesus has. If I be lifted up, I've preached a sermon, it's one of my meeting sermons that I've used quite often. If I be lifted up. And I talk about the ways that Jesus is lifted up. Lifted up from the grave. Lifted up from the cross. Lifted up into heaven. But for us today, for it to be practical and useful, he must be lifted up in your life and mine. We sing the song, there's a royal banner given for display. Christ is our banner, and we ought to hold it high, and we ought to march with Jesus lifted up because he has that power to draw folks to him. So here in our text, immediately, this is after they heard Jesus in the house, immediately many gathered together, so there was no longer room to receive them, not even near the door. I don't know how big that house was, and I don't know how many people were there, but I'm here to tell you, there's something exciting about a full house. I've only experienced that one time in my almost 60 years of preaching the gospel. Back in the early 60s, I held a tent meeting up on what they call Kill Mountains out from Huntsville, Alabama. And we established a congregation and built a small building. And I'm guessing the building would hold about 100 people. And I moved away, and I guess they couldn't find anybody else, so they asked me to come back and hold a meeting. And the first night of that meeting, that building was running over. Every seat was taken. We had folks sitting up here around the pulpit area. We had folks standing in the aisles. And this was before the days of air conditioning. We had windows, and the windows was raised, and folks were standing outside with their heads in the window. Now, I'm going to tell you, that is exciting. I believe that's the most excited that I have ever been in the pulpit, preaching to a full house. And so I think we can have that kind of excitement thinking about how crowded this was. And when Jesus is in the house, the gospel will be preached. You just mark it down. And I'm also here to tell you that if the gospel is not preached, Jesus won't be present. He won't support it. We have far too many congregations today who are not preaching the gospel, and who are not preaching the truth that saves man's soul. And that's so sad to me. I don't know, I guess some of you know, I have a little 5-minute segment on Good News Today, television program. And I got an email recently because I criticized some well-known folks who claim to be members of the Lord's church for being involved in what I consider non-Christian activities. And he was upset over that because I said something negative about that group of people that he held in high esteem. And that's true all over this country. When I was the operations manager for the Gospel Broadcasting Network, I was amazed at the people that opposed that work. There are people that will not support plain, simple gospel preaching. They want to tickle my ears, make me feel good. Don't condemn me for my actions. But when Jesus is present, the gospel will be preached. And the message is far more important than the miracle. I'm going to have to take this coat off if y'all don't mind. I'm getting a little bit too warm. The message is more important than the miracle. I don't know what Jesus was preaching. I don't know what his message was. But I believe I can safely assume, Brother Jim, that he was preaching the same thing he preached in other places. I believe the consistency in Jesus' teaching would let us know something about what he was preaching. Things like the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And things like you're a city set on a hill that cannot be hid. And things like love your enemies and do good to them that hurt you and persecute you. I mean, that message is all recorded in the New Testament, so there's no reason for me to think that he was preaching anything different than what he normally preached. So we come to verse 3. And there come to him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. If you can picture in your mind maybe a stretcher and 4 men, one on each corner, carrying this sick man. I remember years ago, I don't know how many of you might remember this, but years ago, I was called to the bedside of a lady who was in her last days. She knew the truth, but she had never obeyed the gospel. And she said, I want to be baptized today. She couldn't get out of bed. So the family called the ambulance, and they put this lady on the stretcher, and put her in the ambulance and brought her to this building. Me and W.L. Rainey got over in that water, and two men carried that stretcher, and they handed that stretcher over to us. We baptized the lady. It took all four of us. So I can kind of picture this. If you're on Facebook, go to Hopkinsville Church of Christ. About a week ago, my grandson's wife's grandfather was baptized in the hospital. And they've got that on a video. And it is amazing. Of course, they had to get doctors and nurses. They had to get everybody's approval. And he got him on some type of crane-looking thing and over this tub and lowered him down. He was 84 years old. And he died 2 days later. But when I look at that video, tears would come to my eyes thinking about what it took for that event to take place. So I want us to look for a minute at the people involved in this story. There are actually four types or four different groups of people when you think about it. So first of all, we have the four friends. Friends bringing someone else to Jesus. That's what a friend would do, Brother Jimmy. They have names that somebody gave them. This is kind of interesting to me. Somebody said the names of those four men were sympathy, cooperation, originality, and persistence. Well, I mean, you can look at the story and tell that. They were sympathetic with him. They certainly had to cooperate, work together. I mean, if one wanted to go one way and one the other, it would have been a difficult thing to do. The originality to go up on the roof and tear up some man's rooftop. I mean, and think about it, and the persistence. That's what it took. And of course, this wasn't these men's names, but there are characteristics. But I believe that we can say, without a doubt, they cared. You know, one of the saddest passages in the Bible, I believe, is Psalms 142 and verse 4. I looked on my right hand and beheld there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul. Now that's sad. No man cared for my soul. About 50 years ago, Jane and I, with another lady friend, visited that lady's neighbor and talked to her about the Lord's church. And I'll never forget what she said. She said, Mr. Dedmon, if what you are telling me is true, why have I lived in this neighborhood all of my life, next door to folks who are members of that church, and nobody has ever told me about it? Nobody has ever told me about it. No man cared for my soul. That's a very sad, sad verse when you think about it. And we look at these four men, and I know we can say they believed their friend needed Jesus. Mark 2, verse 5. In this context, when Jesus saw their faith, They believed their friend needed Jesus. And they were going to go to all the trouble it took to get him there. I like to hear Brother Glenn Gray tell about his experience when he was first introduced to the church. He said him and Ray Spake were friends. And the church was having a gospel meeting. I think it was when the building was up here on the hill toward town. And Ray said, "You're going to go to church with it tonight?" He said, "No, I'm not." He said, Ray literally picked me up and carried me into that building. And I heard the gospel truth for the first time. Of course, Glenn tells it with a lot more finesse, and of course it drags it out a little bit, but nevertheless, it's an interesting story. And to think about that family, the Gray family, and what they have meant to the Lord's church in this area for so many years, because somebody cared for somebody's soul, and they believed their friend needed Jesus. But not only did they believe their friend needed Jesus, they acted on that faith. You know, a lot of us believe things and we just kind of let them slide by, I guess. We never really do anything about it. We know it's true, but we just kind of put things off. And that's why that verse went by too fast. It was faith without works is dead, from the book of James chapter 2. Unless you act upon your faith, you've got dead faith. But they acted upon their faith, and they worked together in unity. I was talking a little bit about this earlier, about how important it would be for men carrying a stretcher, get a man up on top of the house and down into the room. They had to work together. I have been in situations where brethren were not so cooperative with each other. In fact, there's been times when I felt like the Lone Ranger when he was with his Native American friend, riding together in a hostile territory, and all of a sudden they were surrounded by Indian warriors on horses, and they were obviously dressed for battle, and the Lone Ranger turned to Tonto and said, "What are we going to do?" Tonto said, "What do you mean we, white man?" I have felt that way, you know, at times. I felt deserted, felt that nobody would help, that those that ought to help joined the other side, so to speak. But these folks cooperated. Well, let's look at the second person in the story, the paralyzed man himself. Some versions say palsy, some say paralytic. Palsy in most of our minds indicate just some type of shaking, but actually the context would tell us differently. He was a paralytic, really, if we look at the Greek word. And people involved in this included him. Now we got his 4 friends who cared for him, who knew he needed Jesus, and they were doing all they could to get him there. And notice Jesus spoke of their faith. Not one word is said about this man's faith. I don't know if he had faith or not. I don't know anything about him. The Bible doesn't really tell us. It's kind of interesting when you look at this, because those who still believe that miracles exist today, when they fail, might say to you, you didn't have enough faith. The New Testament miracles did not depend upon the faith of the individual who was the recipient of the miracle. When Jesus saw their faith, I don't know, the man might have believed as strongly as they did, but nothing said about that. And I want to look at what Jesus said to him. First of all, he said, son, which is kind of a term of endearment. If you call somebody son, and it's not unusual for, say, an older guy like me to pat somebody on the back, maybe like Robert, and call him son, because I'm older than Robert. I love him as a son in that respect. And so Jesus showed a term of endearment. Then he said, son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Huh? What? Wait a minute. That's not what we expected to hear, and that's not why we came. We wanted to hear, your legs are healed. And Jesus says, your sins be forgiven thee. Why do you think he said that? Because he knew the man's greatest need. Whether the man ever walked again or not, he needed his sins forgiven. And sometimes we find ourselves in situations similar to that for other reasons, that we just do not realize what our need really is. I was doing some marriage counseling with a couple, and I was talking to him alone because he was the problem. And his wife had left him. He said, if you can get my wife to come back to me, I'll start the church. I said, you need to start the church whether your wife ever comes back to you or not. Your greatest need is your soul. Jesus understood that and recognized that, and he dealt with it. Forgiveness is the greatest miracle that Jesus ever performs. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Why did Jesus come to earth? Did he come to earth to feed people? Well, he fed people. He fed the multitudes. We've read those stories. James, you've read them. Other people, all of you've read them. You've read how Jesus fed the multitudes, how he took a small boy's lunch. He fed people. Is that why Jesus came to this earth? Or was it to heal people? He did heal people, as we find in this story, that Jesus healed people from their maladies. Was it to please people? Well, now he pleased some people. I found out very early in my preaching career, you can't please everybody, no matter how hard you try. Was it to end all wars and suffering? Well, the answer to these questions is no. These are not the reasons Jesus came. In Luke 19, verse 10, I believe Jesus is in a discussion here with Zacchaeus. when he told him, today salvation has come to your house. For he said, the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost. Jesus came to give forgiveness. He died on the cross that your sins and mine could be forgiven. He died to make us free from the guilt of sin. He died that you and I could live. He came to forgive. You remember on the cross, in his dying breath, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The third person of these four types were the teachers of the law that were sitting around. If you remember in Luke chapter 5 and verse 17, when Luke tells this story, and I'm going to have to look at what's up there because part of my screen is hidden. And it came to pass on a certain day, as he was teaching, that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law sitting by, which were come out of every town of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. So we have these scribes and teachers, doctors of the law present. Now, they were well within their rights to check on this teacher they've heard about. And we ought to. We ought to check what people are saying and what they're preaching, what they're teaching. I have never wanted anybody to believe what I say just because I say it. I want to be checked out. I want to be corrected when I'm wrong. And I know it might surprise some of you, but I have been wrong a time or two. I was preaching on the establishment of the church in Morrison, Tennessee. And I really hammered down that the church of our Lord was established in 1933, and any church before was too soon, any after was too late. After services, somebody said, when was the church established? I said, AD 33. They said, you said 1933. I said, I don't believe. I said 1933 because that's not right, and that's not what I believe. Well, listen to the tape. Sometimes I wish they didn't tape lessons. I said it. And I'm glad they checked me on that. It would have been all right with me if somebody had said, hey, wait, right when I said it, so I could have corrected it. Well, they knew it was a mistake. They knew that it was a slip of the tongue. And that's not what I meant to say. But anyway, these scribes, they were in their rights to check on this teacher they've been hearing so much about. But it seems they came with their minds already made up and not with open minds and hearts. Now, I know tonight on your way over here, if you knew I was going to be here, you probably said, we've heard all he's got to say. He preached for us for 8 years, and we've heard him 800 times, and he's not going to say anything that he hadn't already said, But that's okay. But that's not the situation with these folks. They decided in advance that Jesus was not a true teacher. It was a case where we've made our decision, and don't confuse us with facts. You said there was one more bell? All right, I'll try to rush through here. How Jesus responds. This is interesting to me. Notice that no one said anything against Jesus verbally, but he responds to their thoughts as if they had spoken out loud. Only God can know the thoughts of man. Psalms 44, verse 21. That should have been enough for them to say, how did he know what we were thinking? Because they were reasoning. He said, when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, he said, why reason these things in your heart? Which is easier, he asked, to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and take up thy bed and walk? Which one would be the easiest? Well, the easiest would be get up and walk. Why? Because no one could prove whether forgiveness took place or not. It was inward and invisible, and any con artist could say the words, you are forgiven. And they'd never know, was he forgiven, was he not forgiven? That'd be the easiest to say, because if you say, get up and walk, and he don't, or he doesn't, then you know that he's not who he claimed to be. But he said, that you may know the Son of Man hath power to forgive sins. He said to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go thy way into thine house. And immediately he arose, took up the bed, went forth before them all, insomuch as they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. Jesus made his point. Jesus made a statement that puts him on equality with God. Only God can forgive sins. And if he can make the man walk, then he must have forgiven their sins. The fourth person, of course, is Jesus, the Son of Man. And we're going to run out of time, so I won't go a lot of trouble here. But the Son of Man is a phrase Jesus uses most when he refers to himself. It emphasizes God in the flesh, and it emphasizes the humanity of Jesus. Now, it's used in the Old Testament often to refer just to a man or a person, but it's also used in the Messianic prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. I have power on earth to forgive sins. The place to receive forgiveness is here on earth. It'll be too late to be forgiven when life is over. The time to seek out and come to Jesus for forgiveness is now. And so they glorified God because we never saw it on this fashion. And that's really the purpose of New Testament miracles, to glorify God.